Hello and welcome to today's video, which is looking at how you get the marks for using context in your answer. And I'm going to be using this essay, which is a full mark answer done in the 2017 exam. And the question is basically, do we feel sympathy for Dr. Jekyll? Now, it doesn't matter if you haven't read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because I'm going to fully explain how context works here. But obviously, if you have studied this novella, this will be super useful. Okay, well, here are the 4 assessment objectives, which you might be familiar with. And these assessment objectives are common to every exam board. I'm looking at AQA, but the government has made sure that every exam board has the same assessment objectives. Now, if we come down to AO3, we can see that you have to show understanding of the relationships between texts and the context, which means the time in which they were written. Now, you might think, well, I only have to write about context to meet that assessment objective. But actually, you would be wrong, because when a writer, if we look at AO2 here, uses form and structure, actually they're referring to the context of their time. For example, this novella is written in the form of a Gothic detective story, 2 different genres, Gothic and detective story, which would have been highly relevant to a Victorian audience. And that's why the form was chosen, and also why the structure of the novel is chosen, why we don't find out that Jekyll is in fact also changing into Hyde until the very last chapter of the book, because that's part of the detective genre suspense. So context, you can see, doesn't just appear once, it appears in this one as well. Well, let's go up to AO1. Will the context affect that? Well, yes, it will, because AO1 is basically looking at language and interpretations. Well, obviously, your interpretations are going to refer to what contemporary readers at the time, would have thought. Therefore, context, although it's only listed in AO3, is absolutely relevant and central to AO2 and AO1. So this video on context is going to help you meet all of these AOs, all those assessment objectives, and therefore get a full mark answer. Okay, well, back to the essay. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I'm just going to focus on some yellow bits where our student has introduced some context. So the novella is in the Gothic genre, a very formal language, correctly calling it a short novel, novella, instead of a novel. And you'd be surprised how many students call a novel a play or even a poem. And she has correctly identified the genre, sorry. And she's now tried to give an explanation. Therefore, each reaction is exaggerated. So she's arguing that this is a characteristic of the Gothic genre. And she's basically used a piece of information there just about to make a point that's relevant to her understanding of the character. So the reader suspects Jekyll's illness is a reaction to Hyde's actions. And because his actions are exaggerated, that helps the reader work out not only that this is a Gothic novel, but it helps us work out that therefore Jekyll's illness is created by Hyde's actions. Of course, that's also part of the detective novel feature, because we find out that it's not Jekyll's illness at all that's a reaction to Hyde. Hyde is a reaction to Jekyll. Jekyll has created him. Okay, on this slide, we now have 2 instances of context. Stevenson's purpose here. I get very excited when my students do what I say, and I tell them that whatever the literature essay is, it's always about the author's purpose, and the author's purpose is always to comment on the society of the time. So, whatever your novel you're studying, or play, or poem, the writer's purpose is always some kind of comment on the society in which they lived. So she says, I believe it is to expose the hypocrisy of middle-class men and the patriarchy. Now, that's true. And this is the kind of phrase that you can memorize because you know it will be relevant to every single essay that can possibly come up, because this will always be Stevenson's purpose, whatever the question is about. So you can always include it. Here she's got a long explanation of how that's true, so she gets marks for it. And then her conclusion to this extract, to this extract of her essay, to this part of her essay, is here. Yet to him it is more important to protect Dr. Jekyll because of his class. So here Utterson is protecting Dr. Jekyll, and she has argued that that is an example of the hypocrisy which she mentioned up here. So you can see, and the examiner can see, that this isn't just a bit of knowledge about society at the time that she's dropped in. She's linked it to events in the novel. And that's what you have to do. Your context has to fit your interpretation. It can't just sit in there. And next I'm going to show you an example where she gets that completely wrong. So here she's done quite a lot of research on Dr. Jekyll's house, which is almost a physical description of a real house in London at the time that was owned by this famous John Hunter, this surgeon. And you'll pick up what she means as we read it. Dr. Jekyll's house perhaps could represent the depiction of a famous surgeon known for his renowned house in Leicester Square. His name was John Hunter, and much like Dr. Jekyll, his house had a secret. To gain medical knowledge and understanding of human anatomy, he required human cadavers, which is the dead body of a human being, a cadaver, supplied by resurrection men. This was an illegal trade of dead bodies. The cadaver was snuck into the back of his house through a drawbridge, which either led to a preparation room or the operating theatre. Ironically, this made medical advancements. In the extract, Jekyll says that he would ask for Enfield and Utterson to come up, but the place is really not fit. This is an obvious cover-up for something he is hiding. So she's attempted in this bit here, when she's talking about what's being hidden, to link that to what's being hidden in John Hunter's house, but it's not really done very well. And actually, we know that what he's hiding is the fact that he's changing into Hyde. So this is a tenuous link. And all this information about John Hunter's house hasn't really helped her make her points. She could have developed this bit here. Ironically, this made medical advancements. So here she could have discussed how Stevenson could be attacking medical advancements, because Hyde is a medical advance, isn't he? He's created by experiment in medicine, if you like, but what's being created is something worse than the original, worse than Jekyll. So he could be attacking the whole idea of science and medical advancements. And had she made that point here, then some of this would have been much more relevant. But because she didn't, all that big chunk of historical knowledge hasn't scored her any marks at all. So to summarize that, whenever you include some context, you have to make it relevant to your interpretations. If you don't put the interpretation with it, it counts for nothing. So you may well be asking, how on earth did this get 30 out of 30 marks? Well, as we come to the end of the essay, I'm going to scroll through this, and in yellow is where context is used appropriately with interpretation. There, and there, and there, and there, and there. So the whole of the ending, which is a huge amount of writing really, it's half an essay, is full of context which is used properly. Well, I've taught you enough about how to use context. If you're still here, it's probably because you're studying this novel, and I'll go through the context here for you. I'll just get rid of the yellow highlighting, which will make it easier to read. So here, Stevenson's purpose, again, that focus on the purpose, which is what's always going to get you into the top bands, maybe to question the role of Christianity and evolution. So this is two aspects of context: Christian belief of the readers and the growing understanding of evolution as a science. Throughout the novella, we are given many hints that Hyde is a regressive version of Jekyll, such as ape-like, troglodytic, and hardly human. This deliberate use of ape would have frightened the contemporary readers who would have been devoted Christians. However, shortly before the release of the novella, Darwin released his book, The Descent of Man, which stated that man evolved from apes. This idea would have frightened the Victorians by opening up the possibility that God does not exist. Now, let's pause here a minute. Our essay was about us having sympathy for Jekyll. Um, so here she can make the point that we feel sympathy for Jekyll because he is becoming ape-like and troglodytic and hardly human in his version as Hyde. But this would fit any question on Jekyll and Hyde. For example, is Dr. Jekyll a good or an evil man? This information would fit that. Or are we encouraged to believe that Stevenson is against science? Well, this would help us decide on that because we'd see it as an attack on Christianity. My point here is that you can go away and memorize this paragraph and know that you can make it fit every single question. As long as you relate it to the keyword in the question, it will always fit. You'll also see this skillful use of listed quotations. Those quotations will always be relevant. So why don't you memorize them? In fact, why don't you memorize this whole paragraph and then experiment with trying to get it into any essay that you write? When you do that, the wording of it will change, but the quotations won't and the ideas won't, and your skill will be in making them fit the essay question. So the next two paragraphs I'm going to read you are also context, and they also work in the same way. They are paragraphs that you could memorize and use whatever the question. Let's take a look. Darwin argues that it's not the strongest that survives, not the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change, which is very interesting. This is because Dr. Jekyll is stronger and more intelligent than Hyde, but Hyde outlives Jekyll because he is able to change by himself. Another interesting point is that Darwin's book is called The Descent of Man, and descent means to go downwards or regress. This perhaps implies that we, as humans, are acting too much on our own impulses. Thus, Hyde fits into London because London was very corrupt at the time and a lot of violence took place. Therefore, Stevenson implies we could all descend into people like Hyde. Well, it's easy to see how that would link to us feeling sympathy for Jekyll. And hopefully you can see how that would also link to any other question, whatever the question is. Is he evil? No, he's not. He's just a different form of evolution. Or is he moral? No, mankind is not moral. We're all part of this descent. However you want to argue it, this contextual detail will always fit. You can be impressed, as I was, that my student has memorized such a long part of The Descent of Man. And that quotation, too, will always be relevant to any question because it perfectly describes Jekyll and Hyde, doesn't it? Perfectly describes, as she says, Dr. Jekyll's strength and intelligence, but Hyde's survival, temporary at least, because he is more able to change. And finally, she writes a conclusion which looks to the future and has a quotation in it. Those are two skills that I ask my students to use in their conclusions. Hyde is also a creation of God. So this is the Christian context. Essentially, he is part of Jekyll, who was made in the image of God. In existentialism, the second tenet states that existence precedes essence. So she's watched the video on philosophy, and it's actually one that she watched on Never Let Me Go, another novel that we study. But she's used that information brilliantly here to think about whether this is an existential novel. And this phrase here, existence precedes essence, basically means you are what you do rather than what you are. So let's have a look at how she uses this. This means that we gain our morals by living, not through nature. So it's not what we are in our essence, it's how society makes us exist. So therefore, this implies that we behave in a certain way due to society. Do you remember earlier I said the author's purpose is always to comment on society? And she's remembered that in her conclusion. Without a functioning society, we would be ape-like, like Hyde. So this is where she's starting to look to the possible future. What if our society broke down? Would we all turn into Hydes, or would we be moral? So this is because Hyde hasn't been exposed to society for now. I'm going to change that actually, because she probably meant for long. He's not been alive for long, has he? Therefore, he acts on his natural impulses. We feel sympathy for Jekyll because we all fight these impulses. So she's linked what's going on with Hyde to what's going on with the reader, and she's gone back to that key word in the question. So there you go. Exactly how to use context really skillfully to get the full marks. Remember not to just dump your context in without linking it to an interpretation. And you should also feel pretty good in the knowledge that your 30 mark out of 30 mark essay does not have to be perfect. You do get credit for what you do well, and you don't get marks taken away for where you do less well. So I hope you found that super useful. Make sure that context is always in your essay, linked always to the author's point of view, which you will remember must always be linked to society. If you remember those three things, you will get into the top band. Good luck. If you'd like more revision videos, don't forget to subscribe.